Okay, I think I will start. My name's Omar. I'm the Chief Executive of TASO, the Center for Transforming Access to Student Outcomes in Higher Education. Welcome. This is our first event in this building, in this space. We moved in November, so it's great to see you all. I hope you've enjoyed the views. The weather on a better day than earlier in the week or last week. So you're very welcome, and I'm really pleased to see so many of you here for this really important topic, which obviously has some challenging findings that I think we need to address as a sector. But I'm here mainly to give introductions, and then I'm going to chair a panel discussion between the four people that you see in front of you. I did want to say one thing by way of thank you, because Jonathan's actually here. I saw him earlier. There he is. We're very grateful that Advance HE and HEPI have gathered the survey together, but also that they've given us access to these data. Without access to these data, we wouldn't have been able to do this kind of analysis. And I think actually it's worth thinking about that in a context where data is being sort of not shared or is being kind of controlled in some ways. And without data, we don't know the extent of the social inequalities that we have in our society. And I know it's challenging sometimes asking intrusive questions. We require responsible government, but also responsible organizations to collect these kinds of data sensitively and carefully, but also to make sure that we're collecting data over time so that we can see how those inequalities are or aren't improving, and we can hold our politicians, our universities to account. So I think it's a really great example of a partnership. And I am then going to hand over to the report authors next. But before I do so, I wanted to introduce our panelists. So first we have Julia Ellingwood, who is a research fellow at King's College London. Then we have Michael Sanders, who's a professor of public policy at the Policy Institute, also at King's. Next we have Saranya Thambaraja, who is the NUS Vice President for Liberation and Equality. And finally we have Yasmin Benoit, who's an asexual activist and visiting research fellow at King's College London Policy Institute. So we're going to have a nice panel discussion and then time for Q&A. But before we go to the panel, I want to make sure that we get time for you to digest the findings. You do have reports in front of you, so if you can't quite see the screen as well as you'd like, all of the sort of graphs that you see in the presentation are also in the report. So I think without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Julia.
I'm going to grab one of these reports, just I know on this side it might be a little difficult to see the screen, so I'll try to refer the page numbers. Hi, everybody. First slide. Hi. I'm Julia. I'm a research fellow at the Policy Institute, King's College London. I'm going to talk you through some of the results from the report, and then I'm going to hand it off to Michael to kind of tell us what we should think about those results. So any thorny questions you have, please direct them to him. I'm only here to tell you whether the line goes up or down, which you can also see, so it's a very useful approval exercise for all of us. So yes, thank you so much to all of our partners. So obviously Advance HE and HEPI are instrumental in making the data available, so designing and delivering the student academic experience survey, which we'll be talking about. Of course, TASO for hosting and publishing the report, and then our employer there, King's College London. Thanks, Kings. Okay, so just to set a little bit of context. So these two graphs actually, these are not in the report. So you get some exclusive graphs right here. These are actually taken from, the top one is looking at generational attitudes towards mental health difficulties. And then the bottom one is, so the top one's from the World Values Survey. And then the bottom one is ONS data that's tracking suicide rates. It's the middle line is the general population, then it's disaggregated by gender. So we start with this because, in general, these things are showing generally positive things, right? In general, all generations, some steeper curve than others, are showing more and more acceptance of talking about mental health difficulties and admitting that, mental health is an important thing. The bottom, you can see, it's slight, but a gradual and steady decline in suicide rates in the UK, although we do see a slight uptick right there at the end. So this is the context we're working in. So why are we interested in student mental health since, the numbers seem to be doing good, right? So we're looking at student mental health in particular because this is a really crucial time in a young person's development. And if a student has poor mental health, that presents a lot of risks to their different life outcomes. So they might not persist to graduation. They might struggle with entering the labor market. It might impact their lifetime earnings. So this is a really crucial time, and so it's an important reason to look at it. We also have access to large-scale survey data, which is very exciting, with consistent methodologies that are deployed year after year. And this is a rare thing, so we should look at it, right? We're excited to dig into the data and actually understand what it says. And so, yeah, we're lucky to have access to the Student Academic Experiences Survey. If anyone doesn't know what this is, they survey large numbers of full-time undergraduate students every year. And since this is an annual survey, we can kind of understand how things are changing over time. Really quickly, this is maybe the first thing from the report. If you want to refer to page 7. So this is just the demographic breakdown of the sample. You can see here we've just reporting the gender identity and sexuality across the sample across years 2017 to 2024. The reason why we're looking at those waves are that is when the SAES started picking up on mental health indicators. And then as you can see, it's a pretty large data set, so averaging more than 10,000 students reporting every year. So moving on. Okay, so what are the outcome measures that we're focused on? So we're looking at mental health. This is a binary self-reported measure. Basically, a student who's participating in the survey is asked, do you have any of the following impairments or health conditions expected to last 12 months or more? And then mental health is one of those boxes they can check. And that's what the report is really focused on, is whether or not they check that box and who those people are. But for the sake of this presentation, we think it's also worth reflecting on another measure, subjective well-being. And that's captured through a 1 to 10 scale using the ONS4 well-being questions on happiness, worthwhileness, life satisfaction, and anxiety. So the reason why we want to include subjective well-being in here, even though it's not included in the report, is because mental health is, if a student has to report that they have poor mental health, that's actually like a clinical threshold that has to be met in order for them to get that diagnosis. And so the well-being measures are there to kind of enrich the picture. So it's not just about those who are necessarily like accessing healthcare and asking questions about their mental health and getting a diagnosis, but also including those other kind of indicators as well. Okay, so what's happening? So this is tracking mental health over time. This is everybody that was surveyed going back to 2017. This is on page 8 of your report. And yeah, it's not looking great, right? We were just looking at those 2 graphs earlier regarding greater acceptance of mental health difficulties, but we're seeing since 2017 a tripling of students who are reporting that they have mental health challenges. Naturally, we see, as we would expect, a spike in 2020, but it was already on the rise pre-COVID. And it continues to persist even 3 years out of lockdown, right? So obviously, the pandemic and lockdowns, it's got to be a driver, but it's not the whole story. So what are some of the things that can be causing it? Is it greater awareness of intergenerational wealth inequality? Is it phones? It's probably phones. There could also be, this could be due to rising social awareness and acceptance, destigmatization of mental health difficulties, but none of these single explanations are enough to explain this overall trajectory, right? We didn't, it's not because, 3 times the number of people are now aware that mental health is a problem, right? So it's likely many, many factors. Now the picture gets more complex when we disaggregate by gender. So this is also in the report. What? 9 and 10, thank you. Looking at the line graph over here particularly, so the middle is women, the bottom line is people identifying as male, and then non-binary, which is they only started collecting that in 2022, I think. So one thing you can definitely notice is that there's potential widening of mental health difficulties between men and women. And then obviously, the non-binary figures are off the charts, greatly exceeding the mental health challenges faced by their more cisgender peers. So this is looking at another dimension, so looking at mental health amongst cisgendered students and trans students. Similarly, a very large gap. On the left, you see the polled average of mental health across the 4 years, so when they started capturing this data on cis and trans status. And then, again, we have the year-by-year averages there. Okay, and then looking at sexuality, so this displays LGBTQA identities over time. Again, we are seeing an increase across all groups, including straight students, which is in the bottom, but the increase is much steeper for LGBTQA students. Okay, another exclusive set of graphs that you don't get in your report, but you do get because you showed up today. So this is looking at sexuality identities and the 4 well-being scores. So there's a bunch of well-being issues that don't, clear the clinical definition of mental health difficulties like we talked about earlier. These are all framed negatively, so the higher the score, the worse the outcome here. And then it's really hard to see on this, unfortunately. I can't refer you to the report, but you'll just have to take my word on it. So we see queer identifying individuals reporting lower well-being across all measures except for low happiness, which is the bottom right. And across the spectrum, LGBTQA students are significantly more likely to report lower well-being compared with straight students. Ethnicity is a mixed picture. So the graph that you have in your report is this one on the left, so the percent of mental health difficulties broken down by ethnicity. On the right, and this is why we think it's important to include those well-being measures, happiness is not exactly, there's correlations between the two, but there's definitely some ethnic groups that are experiencing higher rates of low happiness compared to white students. So if you were just looking at the left, you can see white students are reporting much higher mental health difficulties than any other ethnic group, which is like an interesting finding, maybe not something you would necessarily expect. But taking into account the low happiness, we actually see that Black students are scoring significantly lower in terms of happiness compared to other ethnic groups. We also see that Pakistani and Bangladeshi students are also reporting low happiness, but score very low in reporting mental health difficulties. I'll go through this really quickly because I feel like we're running out of time. So we did look into class and socioeconomic markers. This is a bit difficult to measure because a lot of people it's a bit of a fuzzy measure. It's hard to get people to self-report on like what class they identify with. It's hard to explain in a survey, but we do have some things. So looking at education and family background, we don't see a ton of very compelling evidence that different. So this is basically looking at parenting and which parents have gone on to higher education and seeing if there's correlation with students presenting with mental health difficulties. And then we also have looking at the difference between private and state education students. The state one is a little higher than private education, but not terribly significant. We also looked at polar quintile. The first quintile is higher, which you might expect. We looked at dropout and mental health. So the left summarizes percentages across the last 4 waves. Mental health is clearly cited as the #1 reason why a student considers dropping out. And then the right compares the top 2 reasons, mental health and financial difficulties. You want to take it away?
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you. Okay. So Julia has presented what we've said, and I'm going to editorialize now, which means if there's anything that you disagree with, you can't disagree with her because it's just numbers. So you disagree with me, and that's fine. because I really enjoy arguing with people. So what you'll hopefully have come away with is these graphs give us a very poor picture of what's going on in terms of student mental health, particularly for some groups. And that picture is worsening, but the resolution on that picture is very high, right? This is not a survey of 25 people. This is a huge, large-scale survey conducted year after year. So we can be pretty confident what we're finding here is important. And it's showing some light on the fact that we need to provide better support for our students as universities. Right? I work at a university, it's important that we do everything we can to support our students. We need to place this into the context of, there is, since the pandemic, reducing levels of volunteering, which means there are fewer people doing jobs for free which help and support people, which means more pressure needs to be put on universities to do things using the funding that they have available. We also have a lack of evidence on what we can do to improve at a light touch, low cost way, student well-being. So we don't know what's going to work there. And we also have a financial position for both individual students in the context of cost of living and in the context of the universities. This may not be a surprise to anybody, there's not a lot of money sort of sloshing around the system right now. So that's pretty foreboding, which is the title of my next slide. So the increase in top-up fees and the pandemic brought a greater focus on widening participation. So the fact that that should say coalition rather than pandemic. So we brought in top-up fees. It's going to be great. We're going to get more people to focus on widening participation. That's why we create things like TASO to say you should be spending your widening participation money on this, that, and the other. However, the picture from the US, where they've been doing this kind of research for longer, is pretty bleak. Right? The Americans are very good. They've got a ton of interventions that get people to go to university, and then, at least in all the studies that we've got long-term data for, they all drop out, which is not good. They're basically just like they're no better educated and they are more indebted, which was not the intention. I believe people do lots of bad things in policy making. That was not what they were trying to do in that instance. We've avoided that here so far. We haven't seen enormous increases on dropout. Dropout from British universities is still very low. And as I have to say in almost every conversation I have these days, Britain is not the United States. We are a different country. There are things here that are different. And we should be pleased about many of those things. I'm not suggesting anything in particular. I'm talking about the weather and the food. That's too loud of a laugh. Neither the weather nor the food is that bad. Anyway, so we've worked so far, but that shouldn't mean that we should be complacent about the risk of it occurring in the future. The freezing of fees has meant that universities have less and less money in real terms to be spending on these things. It may be that that's a cover in some senses, but it is nonetheless true that we have less and less money. The recent unfreezing of fees, it undoes a little bit of the diminishing the value of those fees that we've seen over the last 10 years. I appreciate the government was never going to restore the value of the fees. It's very nice of them to do anything. Please don't hurt us. That lack of funding combined with increasing need suggests we have a really growing problem between supply of mental health support and other kinds of well-being support in universities and demand for that support. The fall in international postgraduate taught students, master's degree students, has plunged the sector into a financial distress and budget shortfalls. Right? We have lived for quite a long time as a sector on this idea that we can just keep on bringing in more Chinese postgraduate students and then everything will be fine financially. And it turns out that that was never going to last forever, which is interesting because you have a university full of people who study history who didn't realize that no empire continues forever unabated. Who knew? Other than literally everyone. Anyway. So this has immediate financial consequences, and it has the effect of reducing the resources that we have available. And it means that we will want to cut the things that are non-essential nice-to-haves, which might mean academics, that'd be fine, we're not actually that valuable. But it also might mean support for our students who actually desperately need it. Geopolitics will make this harder, right? So a more fractious international environment, even aside from the fact that living in a world that's a bit more conflicty is probably bad for your well-being and your mental health, it will also change the nature of our student support and worsen its financial distress. So what can we do about it? So I have some bias, so I'm the chair of trustees for a student mental health charity, so I think we should do that stuff. So heads up, I'm not impartial. But people who are impartial very rarely write reports like this. Right? So people who don't care about student mental health tend not to write this report. So we need to work smarter, and we need to work together as a sector to support our students. We need to recognise that a lot of our learner analytics may lack high resolution for the things that matter. So the reason I'm saying this is the things in our data which most strongly predict low well-being or high mental health are not things that universities know about their students. And so if we don't know it about our students, we can't use it in our fancy learner analytics model to predict risk, right? And so that's a problem. So if we're what we should be doing is focusing on concentrating our resources on student success. How can we help our students to survive and thrive? The fact that student mental health gets better over the course of their time at university means if we can keep them there and support them better, then we can make a dent in this problem. And we need to do that by, as well, focusing on the causes of mental health rather than simply the fact that it's happening. We can't just treat symptoms, we also have to treat causes, of which there are myriad, and this research doesn't really tell us the causes, right? It just tells us that there is a problem rather than saying what that problem is. And so people who are qualitative researchers and who can talk to other people and maintain eye contact, which is the thing that I cannot do, should do that kind of research in order to find out what we can do about it. And then I'll run a trial and we'll tell you if it worked or not. But that's the sequence of things, right?
You have 2 minutes. As much as I'm enjoying this, you have 2 more minutes.
I'm amazed I have as many as 2
Yeah,
more minutes.
well, I'm being generous.
Yeah. Well, I'll owe you something. Any questions?
Very good. Okay, I accept that. That's very nice. Thank you, Julia and Mike. That's really important. I mean, we were joking about it, but the data are really important to understand. It's really important that we get a summary of it, but we also do need this context, right? We are publishing this for reasons that this is these are experiences that are affecting millions of students who are going to our universities, and arguably there's not enough being done to support them. So with that in mind, we have 2 respondents to this. I'm going to start with you, Saranya. I was just curious about your observations. Saranya, you're the Vice President at NUS on Liberation and Equality, so obviously you have a particular angle as someone who represents NUS, but you also obviously are closer than the rest of us on this panel, Yasmin as well, to being a recent student. So I was just curious if you wanted to respond both to the findings, but also how you feel it's reflected or experienced by students today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the findings are not surprising, unfortunately. I think, if you ask most people in this room what they thought this report would say before yesterday, we would probably say something similar, but it's still always very sobering to see it in figures and numbers and graphs. And it is very evident in the actual student experience. And I can very much speak to that from my own experience. I was a queer student who did drop out of uni because of my mental health issues, and I did come back, but I also know of a lot of people who didn't. And coming back was not easy either. There was definitely not the support in place to ensure that I was thriving rather than just surviving. And I often felt like my own caseworker, if you will, which is something that students, I hear time and time again from students that are struggling with mental health difficulties, this idea that you absolutely have to be so good at being a self-advocate because otherwise you're not going to get the support and you're not going to have the things put in place that are going to allow you to thrive. I've been mentally ill since I was 15, so I've become really, really good at self-advocating, but I've met so many students across my time representing them that either developed these mental health issues in university or became conscious to them at university and really, really didn't know where to turn. And when they did turn somewhere for support, they still had to put in so much effort and energy to be heard, to be supported, and to push their cases. So I don't think it's surprising at all that we're seeing so many students with mental health difficulties considering dropping out, and I think it's obvious that it would be the main reason for students to drop out. And other sets of data have shown us how terrifying the figures are around students with mental health issues and their progression and then their attainment and then also their ability to thrive after university and gain employment and so on. This is really something that, the main piece is that once it's gone too bad, it's really hard to pull it back. And I think the early intervention is so key and something that we've really missed as well, maybe not missed as a sector, but obviously we've seen these figures triple in the past however many years, and so we're only just catching up to as a sector, and it definitely has felt like firefighting the effects of these mental health issues for the past 5-10 years, but I really think it's so important that we start moving towards a proactive sector-wide approach, otherwise we're just going to see this get worse. And my biggest fear is that a lot of the time, by the time students get to university, it's too late. A lot of these mental health issues start in schools, in colleges, especially in colleges. And I think it's really important to think about that post-16 sector as a whole, and the transitional care as well between children and adult services and between school and university, because that can be such a destabilizing time for students. And if you're just in general for anyone, but if you're struggling with a mental health issue, that is exacerbated tenfold. So yeah, those are my initial reactions. That this isn't surprising, that it very much reflects with my experience and my peers. And while there has been a lot of really good work done by institutions and by mental health services in the past few years, I am scared that because of all the factors we were talking about, why is this, is it the phones, is it the world around us, none of that is getting better. In fact, I think most people would agree that it's getting worse, that this trend will also continue in the same way if we don't change approach.
Thank you, Saranya. Thank you for sharing your experience. I appreciate that. Yasmin, I thought that if you introduce yourself and then also give your reflections both on the report, but also how the kind of activism you've done for the asexual community and perhaps the wider LGBTQ plus findings, if you have any other further observations. So,
yeah, hi everybody. So I started off as a model, publicly came out as asexual, then fell into the activism world. Prior to that, I was also a crime science student at UCL who assumed I would never actually end up using my degrees, which now, thanks to Michael recruiting me into being a visiting fellow, I now actually am using my degrees to conduct research into asexuality. I've done a lot of campaigning on the other side of the river, nearer to Parliament with MPs about asexual inclusion in the conversion therapy ban, done international work in different countries, a lot of media stuff. And yeah, because there's such a big gap when it comes to asexual representation. When we talk about representation, people tend to always go to media first. But I think that also includes in legislation, it includes in policy, it includes in well-being. And some of the first research I ever did was into asexual inclusion within education, healthcare, and in the workplace. And the experiences people had in education now very much mirrored my own of, on top of all of the stressors that, like you just mentioned, that you have as a student, one of the kind of things that you can often rely upon is that there will be like a community of people you can relate to, who you can be open with, or there's student services. That doesn't really apply so well if you have a sexual orientation that people don't understand. I couldn't find refuge within the LGBT networks and stuff in my universities. When I tried to go to student services for exam stress, their instinct was to try and cure the asexuality first. So then I was like, okay, let me just dodge that whole part of my life within these conversations, which meant I kind of couldn't really be that open with the school counselor, which is kind of counterproductive for what you're there for. So it isn't actually surprising to see statistics that, you know, the asexual community has worse mental health experiences than straight people, for example, but kind of almost on par with what lesbians and other queer people are experiencing, especially I think in the current cultural climate where it's not even just, you know, maybe not fitting in so well in your university or among the people there, but now you also have like the added media stuff going on and social media stuff going on that is definitely making, I think, students hyper aware of things. Since graduating, I've gone back to universities all over London and as far as Romania, actually, and students are so much more engaged and so much more alert of inequalities, and I think sometimes they feel sort of contention in being out like loud about that at their universities. And I think that, yeah, they're just definitely feeling the weight of the world a lot more on top of trying to keep their grades up. I think especially now that universities are a bit more accessible, you have that added pressure, especially if you're the first person in your family to go to university, of I really need to make this work, I really need to get those grades, I cannot be distracted, and also I'm going to be paying this loan back for the rest of my life. So yeah, that's kind of my initial thoughts.
Yeah, and actually, thank you for that. You pick up one kind of recommendation that we sort of hedged a bit, which is there's two different models, I suppose, of student services to try to improve outcomes for LGBTQ plus students specifically. One is to ensure that like general services understand their experience. But the other thought is maybe we need more queer counselors, we need more asexual people in these services. I was curious about what both of you thought about that kind of debate or that kind of way of trying to ensure that the services that are provided are genuinely inclusive, given the sort of, the experience that we're seeing in this report.
I think it's absolutely both. I mean, it's clear we need improved mental health services across the board for students, for all people, for young people, etc. And students are just people, and so if you improve the entire mental health infrastructure of the country, I do think this situation will improve. But I think that is obviously a very long-term goal. I think it is really important to have tailored services within that. There has been research showing that queer people do feel more comfortable speaking to other queer people about their difficulties, particularly, as Yasmin was saying, when someone doesn't understand your experience, it is so impossible to actually be able to be therapized by them or speak to them openly in any way. And I think that is a real fear for a lot of queer people, specifically a lot of trans people these days. Obviously, we know what's going on with the trans debate in the media and so on. My trans friends would probably say that they would be scared to go to a counsellor, a therapist that they don't know is either queer, trans, or specifically, explicitly already know that they're trans friendly and have a deep understanding of all the issues, because otherwise you just risk doing so much more harm than good, even unintentionally, even if the person is trying to help. If as queer people go through such a complex range of issues that and experiences, and if someone isn't able to approach that with understanding, then it is just going to make the situation worse. And I think there has been a lot of examples of really successful work in this area. Before this, I was a sabbatical officer at the University of Bristol, and there was a big sort of drive we have a number of queer counsellors, trans counsellors, and students can specifically identify that they would like to access one of those counsellors when they access wellbeing services. Same goes for a specific pathway for non-white students to provide culturally competent care, because the experiences of people of colour are different, and also international students and the approach to mental health. I think it's absolutely both, but tailoring services is really important, and also having spaces for, I think it's not just the clinical mental health services, it's also community spaces and more peer-to-peer support in the community groups that we're talking about, because sometimes, as Yasmin was saying, you're not going to find the people in the structures and in the institutions that are going to understand you, but you may be able to find peers around you. But it's also an institution's responsibility to facilitate those spaces for students.
Did you want to comment?
Could you repeat the question? Sorry.
Well, yeah. So we recognize that the current services are probably not as accessible as they should be for a number of students, but particularly LGBTQ plus students. And one solution is obviously to ensure that existing services are as inclusive as possible, that we train everyone, including straight counselors and men and women, to be sort of equally responsive and understanding of the different ways in which different people experience mental health. But the other recommendation might be, well, actually, we need to train more and ensure that there are more asexual counselors. So I was just curious if you had any views about how we navigate that, because obviously there might not be as many asexual counselors, but at the same time, the idea that a generic service will always be suitable is sometimes questioned, as Saranya said, and as your own personal experience seems to have indicated.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think we should try and improve upon what's there, but I also think that, there is only so much that you can learn. I mean, I've heard that a lot, like within Black spaces, trying to find a Black therapist or a black counselor is different. Yeah, you can teach a white one about racism, but it doesn't hit the same. So it's and so you do kind of have that knowing that there's someone who has a similar lived experience, or at least that kind of intrinsic empathy for what you're going through. Is helpful. And you know, it doesn't necessarily have to be an asexual counselor, but at least just one that, you know, has at least a somewhat similar lived experience and is educated about it. And that is something that you can broadcast, that is there, that they have made those improvements, so that, because I mean, even if they say, oh, we've tried to make things more inclusive, we've retrained the counselors, it's like, you don't know how far that has extended. And as we kind of, as you can see from, I guess, the self-reporting, and you seeing some groups are more likely to self-report than others, and it's because there are other factors which influence how open you're going to be. And I think kind of normalizing that conversation for different communities will increase that.
I think I've asked enough questions, and we've got a good audience here, so I'm going to throw the floor open. I think, Don, you wanted to ask a question?
Go first, yeah, that's all right.
Can you introduce yourself? Sorry,
Yes.
for everyone, when you ask a question, could you please say, if you're willing, to say your name and where you're from?
Yeah, sure. I'm John Smithies. I'm from Student Minds UK Student Mental Health Charity, and I've been there for just over 7 years, and this is a nice throwback because the first research project we did, well, I did when I joined, was on LGBTQ student mental health, and to see what's changed and sadly what hasn't. I think something that amongst all the stark and challenging data that we found in doing the lit review and surveying students was actually universities are protective for a lot of LGBTQ students. There's something positive that happens in universities for those communities, which is heartening to see, and it was reassuring to see that's still the case. When I think if you asked me to predict what might have been in this, it would have been that things have gotten worse. Obviously, I'd hope they'd improve, but that would be slightly optimistic. So my question is, with everything going on in the wider global political context that we know is harmful to our students and our communities, what can universities do to continue to be bastions and kind of protecting these communities, and what can they do better to be, I suppose, improve internally as well?
I think I'll start with you, Yasmin, then Saranya, and then Michael, if you want to offer an opinion on that, or Julia. Go ahead, Yasmin.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because I think that, I guess, one kind of characteristic of universities is that you have a bunch of people with different opinions and different thoughts that want to say them, and sometimes those thoughts and opinions might not be the best ones. I remember when I've done some work at the University of Oxford, not to call them out, but whenever I know I've done some debates at the Oxford Union, and they would platform some not so nice people, and then there'd be conflict between one college and the other. The more liberal ones didn't like what was happening there, then they didn't feel safe at their university because they wanted to do this. But then those other kids then didn't feel included because they couldn't platform the right-wing people, and then it all got very confusing. But I think that, I mean, you might not be able to stop them, but I think at least as a university, and not just of universities, but any kind of powerful institution, I think nowadays, to be able to kind of openly say, this is actually what we stand for, and this is what we do discourage, because I think a lot of the time nowadays, lots of places are trying to be quieter about that. Like, I know lots of companies and big powerful places that are like, oh, we'll do inclusive stuff, but we don't want to say it because then we'll start getting backlash online, so we'd rather just be really quiet about it, which isn't helpful because other places feel like, oh, so nothing's happening, so we don't need to do anything either. So I think that just trying to, in the culture of the institutions, being open about what they do believe in, even if they can't stop everyone from expressing what they want, I think would kind of help students to feel like, okay, this is a place where I can potentially be more open.
Yeah, and I was also wondering from NUS's perspective, like what are you going to be campaigning on and doing? Obviously, it's important organization for students.
So at NUS, one of our 4 main priority campaigns for the next year and a half is trans and non-binary student work, to obviously reflect what's going on in the world. And I'll be leading on that project. And during my planning of it, I agreed on, it's obviously all so depressing, and the whole picture looks very, very bleak. But the one piece of hope I have is that I do actually think our sector does have the potential to be a really positive place for queer people and for trans people, and has the potential to be a really strong ally if we choose to be. And I think the way we do that is, first of all, we absolutely do not capitulate to the political culture that's going on around us right now. In fact, we double down on our support for queer people and trans people, our support for EDI measures, I know that's becoming really, really difficult for people, anyone from universities. Like, we know about, what the US is trying to do over here, but I think it's so important that we just try and, not capitulate to any of that, and show really active allyship. Like, we need investment in this, and by that I obviously mean money, but like, we know that universities don't have money right now, so almost what's more important is I want the sector to be really invested in this fight, in the same way that I feel like we've seen the sector become increasingly invested in things like sexual violence, in anti-racism work, in reparative justice over the past 10, 15 years or whatever. I think this is really the time to look proactively into the future, what is going on around us, and anticipate what's going to happen for queer students and trans students particularly in the next sort of couple of decades, and put measures in place now to try and tackle that, because it is just going to get worse. You know, trans rights are being curtailed in this country, healthcare rights particularly, and so we're going to be seeing students entering universities that were unable to transition earlier in life are going to be dealing with even more acute issues once they're there. And so I'm really worried that if we don't start acting right now, that we're going to have another firefighting situation in 10, 15 years, and we already know how bad the suicide rates are amongst queer people and trans people in particular. So sort of the general message would be like, just be as proactive as possible and double down and be an a loud ally and show queer people, show trans people that the university sector, the HE sector is not planning on sort of being a part of this culture war, and instead is planning on stepping into the space of supporting these students and holding them, as it were. And obviously, please do work with NUS, please do reach out to me about how we can collaborate on work with, on the trans work. I think, you know, this is a sector-wide thing, and student voice is absolutely central to it. You know, we know you can't do things for marginalised people without them, and so keeping queer people at the centre of that discussion and doing the qualitative research and doing the co-creation is so, so important. But also, you know, the sector has power. We have a lot of soft power, a lot of hard power. We have research power. You know, the reports like this are what drives change, and we need more of that. And you know, there's so much misinformation going on right now with this culture war. We are in the position to tackle that with real research, real findings, to make the case for queer people, for trans people, and to stand up and say that, and to maybe even lobby the government and advocate for the government in favour of queer students. I think, you know, the sector can be doing that more proactively too.
Thank you. I know you're both employees of universities, Julia and Michael, but do you have any thoughts on how the sector sorry.
I will start by saying that my views are not those of the institution that paid my salary. Just to be clear. So I think there is a temptation which we've given into over the last however long to retreat from those who hate us, in the hope that by retreating and giving ground, they will stop hating us. And as it turns out, they don't stop hating us. They hate us just the same. So I think we should learn that lesson from history, that if we retreat from our values, all we are doing is retreating from our values. We are not making ourselves safer. So Benjamin Franklin said, those who are willing to sacrifice essential liberty for temporary safety will deserve neither and lose both. And there is something to be taken from that. He also invented the kite, I think, so that was also great. The substantively, and I am the patriarchy given human form, insofar as I'm a straight white guy who has his professor in front of his name, and I wear this. It's like screaming out that I'm the villain of this particular story. And for people like me, of which there are a great many in higher education institutions, often in positions of power and authority, we need to recognise the burden of solving these challenges must fall on us, because we do not think that the victims of things should be the ones who have to solve them. Right? When you're a victim of a crime, the police are supposed to investigate that crime. Right? People with power are supposed to protect those people who don't have power. That's what power is for, I think. Your mileage may differ. And that means we have to be understanding. We have to take the energy to understand people who are different from us, and we must work out and ask them, how can we best help you? How can we best be allies? And this is partially a moral thing, right? It's important, but it's also it's a numerical thing. So I've done very back of the envelope calculations without a pen based on the graphs, and LGBTQA people are likely to represent about 10% of students and about 35% of students that need mental health support. Trans students are likely to represent about 1% of students and about 14% of students who need mental health support. It is not practical, unless every LGBTQA plus person becomes a counsellor, for us only to provide services in that way. Which is not to say we shouldn't increase the volume of that, but it means that the cis-het, white, etc., people like me, counsellors need to get better, because so much more of their demand, the need, is going to be coming from those communities, and we have to recognise that and be better at it. At the moment, we're people in an ER who don't know how to deal with most of the injuries that are coming into the ER, because, well, I personally don't experience those injuries, so I only experience
Yeah, you wouldn't get a very good job appraisal at the end of the year if you're just like, well, I can't really service a third of the people who I'm supposed to. Yeah, you certainly wouldn't get a pay rise. Can I go to the audience? I'm going to take two to three questions. In fact, I've got three hands over there. So, gentleman in the back, woman here, and then that woman. So you first, there.
Yeah, hi, my name's Aaron, pronounced Gide. I represent a bunch of different organisations. I also work for Summarises, work for My Life, My Say, I've worked for US before, so yeah. My thing is mainly about intersectionality. When I was looking at this data, it's really interesting, really fascinating data, but obviously it doesn't speak to the nuance of like individuals' perceptions. So for instance, it was really interesting to see about Black Caribbean, Black African, and Black Other, which probably refers more to Black British. But for instance, in some very much smaller research that I did when I was a sabbatical officer, I found that Black queer people experience mental health about 2.5% more likely than their white queer counterparts. So for me, I guess the question is, how do we ensure that with all this that we're doing, that intersectionality plays a functional part? Because often when we're kind of making progress and we see developments, it's going to be for those people who are the most represented, even within marginalised communities, that are going to be like, oh yeah, this is now working, so we can stop here. But actually, what you'll find is that when you take a step back, you'll realise that actually a lot of the community that is supposed to be served has not been served because those elements haven't been met.
Thank you. Thank you. Got the question? You've remembered? I'm going to just take two more because we're running this lady in the front.
Okay, I'm Remy, Learning Participation Researcher at Rhombare School for Dance. I look at like a very small amount of data, but I notice patterns. So it's kind of more for the data people. And obviously, like when a student goes into higher education, they're on like a personal journey. And I find that with like sexual orientation questions, that like students are often changing from year to year. You know, year 1 they're straight, year 2 they're gay, year 3 they're bi. And I also see mental health cases increasing year on year as well. So I just wondered in your research, how do you kind of disaggregate mental health problems rising with discovering your sexuality, and how that would impact you so much? Because, you know, learning that you're not straight might be quite like, it might cause you quite a lot of stress. So how do you see that in the research?
And one more question here.
Yes, I'm Emma, and I'm from Emotion, the Student Services Organisation, so we represent student services. Obviously, you've all hinted at the fact that the financial time in the sector is really difficult at the moment, and a lot of this work will disproportionately fall on student services staff who are reporting to us, you know, burnout, they're being asked to do more with less.
Yeah.
And so I was building on Dom's question around like quick wins, almost like if a student services staff had no money, which let's be honest, probably likely in lots of cases, what could they do? Whether that's based on this data or just generally to improve the situation, kind of being realistic at this point. There's so much that needs to be done, but if there's no money and student services aren't known for given lots of money from universities, like what can be done in this space as a quick win?
I thought I'd turn you if you wanted on intersectionality.
Okay. It's not just me being dumb, but I didn't realize that Black Other meant Black British. I thought it meant like Aboriginal or something. Is that what
does
does
mean
it
Black
mean?
British. Almost everybody in this data is British.
So what is Black Other?
So you'll have to ask the people who answered that.
Okay.
It's people who, generally it's people who are don't identify in those with
Okay.
the other boxes.
Oops, sorry, my phone fell on the floor. Okay, yeah, so I feel like what I've often noticed when I've had conversations, I remember when I was just doing a thing at Parliament over there, like they'll have a thing that will be like, okay, well this is women's healthcare and this is just regular healthcare, and then this will be the LGBT thing, and this will be the Black thing, and they'll like group everything off as though these aren't issues that will just impact everybody. Like healthcare is not also women's healthcare, and I think that sorry, I'm trying to remember what the question was, but that was what my thought process was.
I think Aaron's question on
combining
intersection.
and like tackling the intersectionality without separating it so much, in that maybe giving, like I'll often see like they'll give this kind of training to LGBT things and I'll keep it over there, but then they don't then know much about racial issues, or if you're then working on like with Black counselors or with Black staff, they then don't know that much about LGBT things, and then there isn't always that much overlap, even though all of these experiences intersect, as that other question was about, how there's other factors in self-discovery and how that can impact mental health, social class can impact it. I think it's just more just understanding that these are almost a lot more universal experiences and not training people in one specific thing because they fit that niche always. Would kind of be my suggestion, but I've also partially forgotten the end of the question. So I was trying to remember all three.
That's okay. Well, I was curious if that sort of reflection that actually people change the way that they identify in terms of sexual orientation. It does make sense too if people are 18 years old and coming and maybe don't have prior sexual experiences or very limited. I was curious if you had any observations on that or.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you kind of see that in the data. Like some groups like rapidly raised and some kind of got less. I'm sure that if you were doing the same stuff on postgraduates, the responses would probably be a bit different. It is a time of self-discovery, and I think then at the same time, it's like, do people have support with that self-discovery, and that's something that you're not always seeing, or sometimes, even with student groups, as I said, I as an asexual person that was a student, even if I went to the queer groups, they didn't know what the hell I was talking about either, so I couldn't go there, and the counselors didn't help. So I think that, just like understanding that there is fluidity to it, and it is a time of change for a lot of people, and being able to support people through that instead of being like, we're just going to tackle this one thing as a stagnant, standalone issue, when really that is something that intersects with all the different parts of your university experience.
And I thought if you want to say more about intersectionality as well, but the student services point I thought was maybe something you might want to comment on.
Yeah, so I mean on the intersectionality, completely agree, but I think I really agree with that point about like training people on all the different marginalizations and all the different specific issues, but then there needs to be a way to bring that together. Like, maybe I'm wrong, but from all of my experience, I think there is a gap in terms of intersectionality training for mental health and well-being services staff, but also just in general. Like, we learn about culturally competent care for various ethnicities. We learn about all of the different queer identities, but I haven't seen much good training in the sense of putting all of those things together and using real lived experience examples. I think you're not going to get that level of understanding without using real examples. I think there is maybe some research, some training to be developed with students at the absolute core of it, talking to students that have various intersecting marginalized identities, and yeah, it would be qualitative research, really understanding how those different identities intersect and play out in a mental health setting. And yeah, so I mean, I think like the baseline is to at least have everyone trained really well in all of the different separate
And
things.
I think there's one thing for the hard stretched
Yes.
student service person.
In
What
terms,
should we be trying to, you know?
if
Because
you
I
have-
think you're also right that, I mean, a lot of the people working in this just really do
Yeah.
want to help, and they themselves are starting to feel pressure too, so.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's really tricky. To answer the question of with no money, I think the best thing you can do in those instances is focus on the community and belonging aspect and facilitating more spaces for that community to emerge within students, and just giving students the awareness that there is that intention, that desire to create those spaces, those changes, and those conversations. And sometimes I feel like it doesn't need to be all worked out before it gets to the students, if you know what I mean. Like, in a way it does, obviously, with mental health. Like, you want to be very sure that what you're doing is not going to make anything worse. But I do think it's also okay to be honest with students about where things are at, especially when we're trying to grapple with these bigger issues of identity and how they intersect with our well-being. And I think students appreciate being actually brought into that conversation and asked and talked to about how they can be supported. And I think even that process of being involved in creating support for other students maybe in similar situations as yourself can be a supportive environment in itself and can give a sense of purpose to a student that's really struggling.
Did you want to say anything about the data, Michael?
I was going to, if that was all right.
That's the one that I was going to ask you about, because we're running short on time, so just that one, please.
So there's two bits which I can talk about in data. So the first is intersectionality question. The reason we don't break it down by group is because the samples become too small to say anything meaningful. And what you end up with those very small samples is saying, oh, actually it turns out that it's fine if you're of Black Caribbean heritage and asexual, so we can just ignore you, whereas actually that's just a sampling error. So that's the reason we don't do that, is because we end up being wrong and saying dumb things. And I say a lot of dumb things, but not usually with graphs. On your question, it's a really excellent question. We don't have what we would call panel data. So I can't see this student in year 1, year 2, year 3. And so we're looking at a cross-section. Obviously, people undergo changes in their identity, if not necessarily who their core self is, over the course of their time as a student. And I guess what I would do is push back a little bit against the suggestion that is inherently stressful, right? So there's a really great book, I can't remember who it's by, called Gender Euphoria, which is sort of really changing the way we talk about people discovering their gender identity and framing that in it. Often it is a very positive experience for people to be the person or to know that they are the person who they've always actually been. And so I would be reluctant to suggest that it was necessarily a positive or a negative experience for people going through those changes. But I don't have the data to support that either way. I'm just referring to a book that's great and everyone should read.
I know we need to wrap up, but we started 5 minutes late, so if there's any questions on this side, because I didn't ask any other than, yeah? You got, is there anyone else who hasn't asked a question? I will ask you. Dom, you'll get the final question. Yeah, here, please. Someone?
So I'm Catherine Soller from KCL, work in the works team there, and just really interested what you were saying earlier about the problem, the issues are there by the time students come to university. So what in terms of working closely with widening participation and those, what would you say can be done? You know, what sort of key things would you say could be done to support students when they actually, before they even start?
Sorry, Dom, why don't you throw in this is the last question.
Well, it's not an extra question, it's a comment and slight response, because it'd be remiss of me not to plug something that's hopefully useful to the sector, especially if they've got no money.
Is it like as a trans student?
It is.
I've already shared it with our members.
Very good.
I don't know, you can do
Yeah,
it.
just to people that aren't aware, we've just launched through Student Space free online, accessible digitally, psychoeducational resources for trans students developed with an organisation called Gendered Intelligence and a brilliant group of trans and non-binary students. So that's a available through Student Space. Find out more online.
Thank you.
Cheeky plug, my colleague.
That's okay. And I'm going to give the panel an opportunity to give last comments as well as responding to that question about, university is a transition time as well, so how can we make that transition smoother? Start with you, Julie, if you have any final observations, and maybe 1 or 2 minutes, 1 minute each from before I do.
I'll not speak.
Okay, Julia, then Saranjan, and
This
yes.
is about making the transition.
Yeah, yeah. I need,
So, I mean, I can't claim to be an expert here. I'm probably the least steeped in these issues. I mean, I think I agree with Michael's point. We can't keep relying on young people to do the problem solving for us. I think there is this tendency when, we set up youth panels, we try to incorporate youth voice in our research designs and our programs, and I think that's wonderful. But at the end of the day, it's those who have access to resources, who are empowered to make decisions, to, do something. We can't just keep relying on young people to come up with solutions. So.
yeah. Saranjan?
To that question, I think, onboarding is really, really important, and ensuring that anyone that has declared a mental health issue is immediately given all of the various things that they might need to access with support in a very sort of direct and individualized way as well, if possible, because obviously the start of university is such an insane time. You're being bombarded by a million things from a million different places. And it might take a student a second to actually get to setting up support, but it's those things you can do really early to preempt that, like ensuring that the students are all signed up with their GP, ensuring that the accessibility of the wellbeing services is actually accessible. We are still seeing staggering wait times, and we also do know that students in sort of their first year of university will take a bit longer to reach out for support and will wait until it's a bit worse, and at that point it might be already too late. So really doing as much messaging as you can towards the beginning of term about reach out as soon as you start struggling, whether there's no bar for how much you need to be struggling to reach out for support, because sometimes we're talking about mental health difficulties, mental illnesses often, but there has been a sort of increased pathologization of sort of any kind of struggle in recent years, and that is absolutely not to say that any of it's fabricated or exaggerated. It's a complex thing, but anyway, sometimes students might not realize that they're experiencing something that might turn into a mental health difficulty. It might just start out as stress, and that is also important enough to address and to tackle and to talk to someone about, even if it's not mental health or wellbeing services, even if it's your personal tutor or someone in your accommodation or whatever. So just really, really putting that information out there to all students, but ensuring that those with mental health, with declared mental health issues, but also to queer students, to disabled students, to those that we know are going to experience higher rates of mental health issues, ensuring that information is really targeted and reaching them.
Yes.
I can't remember what the question was. I get so engrossed in the answers.
Well, you've got the last word. Any final reflections?
I'm just grateful to be here because I think it's really interesting that this data actually looks into the asexual population. A lot of things don't. Not only is there not really standalone research into things, but there isn't much that breaks it down and takes these different groups into consideration. And I think the fact that you're going to have this year on year is going to be really valuable. And I think it's great that we're even at least starting to have these kind of intersectional discussions. So yeah, just my first time at TASO, so thanks for having me.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'll quickly wrap up because I know it's also warm here. There is more food. I do want to thank my colleagues, especially Francesca and Alicia, for helping to organize the event, and also the staff here, the videographer, for all of your work. There's a bit more time here if you want to continue to mingle. I do think that final point is a really important one. Evidence research by itself doesn't change the world, but without the data, we don't know where the problems are and where we need to tackle our focus and our insights. And I think I agree with Michael. Over the next few years, we're going to need to continue, all of us, to ensure that we don't forget the fact that these issues are not just affecting everyone, but they're particular inequalities that we need to continue to address. And that sort of TASO is focused on ensuring that we are doing what works, but what works to tackle inequality, which means we're driven by the value of, you know, ensuring a better student experience for everyone. So thank you to everyone. Thank you to my panelists. If you could please congratulate. And I think we have the space for another half hour or so.
Another hour.